So one reason that I added to this list, your 4 reasons are fine and everything, but the reason why I think that bears have less ASCVD is they usually just straight up feed on human trash, which has huge amounts of processed foods, which contain seed oils, and those PUFAs in the seed oils, I think that's what's protective against atherosclerosis in bears.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about what you're replacing in the diet, right? So if you have a bear that's eating a unhealthy diet with saturated fat in it from the salmon, if they just trade some of that salmon for some discarded Twinkies or something like that from a human diet, then you're going to help decrease that LDL.
Yeah, exactly.
Because less saturated fat, less LDL.
The PUFA's action on the LDL receptor.
Yeah. So now how about some actual reasons that bears don't get atherosclerosis? Because by human standards, bears are morbidly obese most of the time.
30%, 40% body fat?
Upwards of over 50% if you happen to be a polar bear. Sedentary for months and months at a time, depending on how long they're hibernating, sometimes up to 6 months.
Yep.
So sedentary, obese, very high lipids. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. People will like this first one, some people. Larger LDL particles. Various influencers love to point out that large and fluffy particles are favorable. I think studies do show that things like a better omega-3 index are associated with larger LDL particles.
Huge LDL particle.
Better, that's a big LDL particle.
Yep.
Better metabolic health. Directionally, you see larger LDL particles. And then you see the inverse. You tend to see more small, dense LDLs and things like diabetes or people who are like smoking, for example.
Yep.
But I wouldn't bet my life on LDL particle size.
How large of an LDL particle? Is this the size of a bear LDL to scale?
To scale, probably so.
This is Thomas Dayspring, a famous lipidologist. This is his lipoprotein structure. And one interesting thing we were discussing is the reason why the LDL is so light and fluffy, if you will, is that their mutations in ApoB, because they have a lot of ApoB mutations.
Yeah, looking at the polar bears, they had 9 missense mutations in ApoB. And yeah, this could affect particle size. I think particle size is mostly genetic from what we know. Something in the realm of 30 to 60%, depending on the paper you're looking at. And then even things that we may talk about is like the triglyceride content versus the cholesterol ester content in the core. This model actually happens to resemble that of a bear more than that of a human, LDL particle anyway.
If you can't see that, it's about 50-50 triglycerides and cholesterol, triglycerides being the green, cholesterol being the yellow.
So this
and
may
it
be
is
more,
about 50-50. This is more similar to a bear, whereas a human would have more cholesterol, as you mentioned.
Yeah, or perhaps it could be a VLDL, which would carry more triglyceride in people.
That's true. It could also be a VLDL.
Which bears' LDL particles tend to resemble humans' VLDLs that carry the triglycerides more closely.
VLDL being triglyceride carrying, except some people always point out, well, chylomicrons also carry triglycerides, I believe, primarily or just absorbed triglycerides from the gut for chylomicrons, whereas the VLDL carries the other triglycerides.
They also have better HDL efflux capacity. These are tests that I guess you can get like a Boston Heart or perhaps Cleveland Heart Lab. You can see on paper how well it looks like your HDL might function. But again, I have not got this test myself and I wouldn't bet my life on it. But based on the laboratory data in bears, it looks like if they are having these larger LDLs occasionally get into that subarterial space, into the arterial wall, that the HDLs are sort of removing any cholesterol esters that get deposited there so that they don't have fatty streaks even, not even the earliest stages of atherosclerosis, even at an advanced age. And then one that was kind of interesting, one that I haven't really looked a lot at in terms of human data, was the differences in electrical charge there. So they have a higher negative charge or a less positive surface charge on their LDLs. So another reason that the bear LDLs would tend to resemble human VLDLs more.
So one reason that I added to this list, your 4 reasons are fine and everything, but the reason why I think that bears have less ASCVD is they usually just straight up feed on human trash, which has huge amounts of processed foods, which contain seed oils. And those PUFAs in the seed oils, I think that's what's protective against atherosclerosis in bears.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about what you're replacing in the diet, right? So if you have a bear that's eating a unhealthy diet with saturated fat in it from the salmon, if they just trade some of that salmon for some discarded Twinkies or something like that from a human diet, then you're going to help decrease that LDL.
Yeah, exactly.
Because less saturated fat, less LDL.
The PUFA's action on the LDL receptor.
They'll clear out those particles faster. But I sort of think of the electrical charge sort of like a magnet. You can think of a magnet, two opposing charges. One is going to be sort of floating there. And in humans, perhaps you have less floating and more bumping into the wall of those LDLs. Kind of how you can think of it. It probably isn't a perfect analogy, but might help people kind of visualize what we mean when we're talking about the charges and LDLs in the arterial wall.
It's a hovercraft that is floating higher above the surface of the wall and thus not scraping into it. Another thing to consider with bear lifespans is their average lifespan is only, a couple decades. But even with that, you would expect atherosclerosis starting as an atherosclerotic streak. So it is like, let's say a bear did live to 80 or 100 years, they probably would have less ASCVD. And then another thing to consider is, the main cause of death in bears is starvation. So if you're comparing bears that are in a food desert, if that's such a thing as bears, there's not many bear grocery stores, less trash cans. Bears with lots of human trash cans where they can feed on human foods, those bears will not die as often, they'll reproduce more. And then bears that are, not near a salmon stream or a human trash can, they will die more.
Yeah, I think hunting and starvation are the top two causes, specifically for polar bears, which are the largest bear. It's very close between polar bears and Kodiak bears, both of which can get, like we mentioned before, upwards of 50% body fat with seemingly no consequences. Do you think their joints hurt?
It's a good question. Do bears limp when they're old? I assume they do, but probably just because they've been injured from fighting. I don't know. I get, the whole wear and tear model of degenerative joint disease is not true, certainly. But I'm sure that it helps that they only have 20 years of using the joints instead of 100.
Well, and they're taking at least several months out of each year off using the joints. They rest, let the connective tissue adapt, and then go back out and bulk up another season.
Didn't that make back pain worse when we tried that for back pain?
Works for bears. Works for me.
Yeah. Maybe an interesting future area of study.